Alright guys, I want to take a minute. We're going to talk a little bit about some knife and the dynamics of it. However, before we get too far into it, we need to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions. There was a case where I had a discussion with a police officer who had responded to a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The individual had a pistol and had shot himself between the web of the toes. Obviously not a life-threatening injury. However, the individual went into shock and ended up dying from the injury. Now, it wasn't the injury itself that killed him, it was the shock that occurred as a result of it. But I would even argue that if you back up one step further, it wasn't the shock that killed him as much as it was the mindset. We are all programmed to think that if we're shot, we're supposed to die. This is something that comes from movies and TV and books and stories and so on and so forth. We have this idea of being shot and the bad guy falls down and he's dead and he's out of the fight. And realistically, that's just not the case. Military doctor, Dr. Michael Fackler, did a study, and in his study he found that 95% of gunshot wounds were survivable if the individual was able to receive medical attention quickly. By the same token, he had determined that 80% of the body is non-lethal when it comes to receiving gunshot wounds. Now obviously, receiving a gunshot wound to the leg is not necessarily fatal unless it's a femoral hit, and in that case, it's not fatal if you get a tourniquet on there soon enough. So understand that some of these things are time dependent, but the only place that is instant incapacitation is going to be in the brain box. All right. That being said, the same philosophy can be applied to the knife. The dangerous part of the knife, guys, is that last 4 inches, or however long your blade is. It's not just because the blade is there does not mean it's some sort of lightsaber, laser beam, or something like that, that if I even touch it, all of a sudden I'm going to lose a limb. Okay, it doesn't work that way. All right, and just to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to take, okay, pretty sharp knife, tactidactical. This thing is awesome, guys. Okay, I'm not dying here. I'm actually pressing pretty hard. Okay, this thing is razor sharp. The blade itself is not dangerous. It's the cutting. It's the slashing motion. It's the stabbing of the tip where it becomes dangerous. The sides, okay, the profile, the sides, not dangerous. The back, unless it's a two-edged knife, not dangerous. We have to get over this mindset that says that if I go anywhere near that thing, all of a sudden I'm going to lose a limb and my hand's going to get chopped off and I'll immediately die. And you have to get out of that mindset. That mindset will not only kill you, but it will actually paralyze you in the fight and prevent you from being able to accomplish any kind of disarm whatsoever. So we need to have a healthy respect for the knife and what it's capable of. In my opinion, at close range, the knife is far more dangerous than a gun. However, gun obviously gives you that range, it gives you that standoff. But from a civilian perspective, where most of our encounters with individuals are probably going to start off as individual type confrontations and escalate into a life-threatening type scenario, that knife is ridiculously lethal. Understand that a gunshot wound is going to put a 9mm hole or a .45 caliber hole, 0.45 inches. It's going to put a hole in your body, and sure, it will expand, and that's where we get into the study of terminal ballistics. But understand that the knife is going to actually open you up. All right. Now, one of the things that I talk about is electrical failure, mechanical failure, and hydraulic failure. All right. The electrical failure, the only place you're going to get that is in the brain box, the brainstem. Mechanical failure is anything that I can get from severing ligaments, tendons, muscle to actually prevent the operation of a limb. All right. You can also get into this by through shooting, blowing away at joints and things like this. You can destroy certain joints and such, through the use of firearms. However, once we get into hydraulic failure is something that, depending on where I hit and how open of a wound I create, is going to determine the amount of time that individual has. For instance, slashing across the wrist and opening this up is going to bleed out, let's say, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, okay? However, cutting up the inside and letting more blood out, cutting up the inside, I'll bleed out that much faster. Okay, the idea being is that the more pressure that I allow out of those arteries, the more blood begins to flow out. My heart essentially works like a pump to pump out all the blood onto the ground, and then I end up dying that much quicker. So I don't really want to get into the medical side of this. There are people who are far more educated on this than I am. However, I want you to understand the basic mechanics of this. The knife itself is dangerous only on the cutting edge and the tip, and only when in motion. A cutting edge, even on a ridiculously sharp knife, is not dangerous. The sides of the knife are not dangerous. Even if I were to grab this knife completely around the blade, placing this in my hand, even if I were to grab this here, it's not dangerous unless I pull the knife out. So understand that if I'm in a situation where I need to get a hold of a knife and an individual is going to town and stabbing on me, which you see more often than not is people trying to not engage the knife. They're almost staying away from this thing, and that is to their own detriment. Getting in and attacking that knife, even if it means me possibly getting cut, guys, when we get into a boxing match, we don't expect to walk out of there without getting punched. When I get into a grappling match, I don't expect to get in there without being put in some compromising positions. When I get into a gunfight, there is a very real possibility that I'm going to end up shot. But all of a sudden we get into knife techniques and people are like, oh no, I'm not willing to adopt any technique that actually begins to put me in a position where I could potentially get cut. Guys, when I am physically fighting somebody, I realize that I'm probably going to get hit. However, the only choice I have in the matter is where I get hit. I can either leave my chin out and take one on the chin, or I can block and take it on the arm. The same philosophy applies to the knife. If I can control that knife, even if it means grabbing a hold of this blade to disarm him, as long as I control his wrist so that he cannot pull that knife out, I can execute a disarm even by grabbing the blade. And I would much rather take some minor cuts to my hand and disarm him and give that knife back to him with the business end first than I would to stand by and try and take a standoff approach and end up getting killed as a result of it. So we want to get out of this mindset that there are no consequences. People get hurt in fights. Understand that. That's why we call it combat, okay? You're going to get hurt. You're going to get hit. You might get cut in a knife fight. I would guarantee that you're probably going to get cut. However, there are numerous cases of individuals who have survived 62 stab wounds, 37 stab wounds, so on and so forth. You have as much chance of being stabbed and being killed as you do of being shot and being killed. There are areas on the body that are vital to survival, and there are areas that are not immediately life-threatening. So the only choice that you may have in the matter is not necessarily whether or not I get stabbed or cut, but where I get stabbed and cut. And if it is something that I can actually put a pawn out there, or I can put a bishop out there and end up taking his queen or his king, then I'm going to do that, because that's how the game is played. All right? So understand that. Work on that mindset, okay? If you're shot, you're not dead, and if you're dead, you won't know it. The same philosophy applies to the knife. If I'm cut, I'm not dead. And if I'm dead, I won't know it. So you guys think about that. We're going to get into some knife techniques in the next week or so. So train hard.